Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is part 2 of the engine rebuild, I guess you could call it, or engine cleanup. So in the last episode, obviously we stripped off all of the ancillaries off the engine. The only thing we left on was the pump on the other side. And the reason I left that on is because I did not want to disturb any of the timing. All the timing belts and stuff are still on there. So in this episode, I'm going to be painting the block. And I'm going to start painting all the various brackets and stuff that I took off. Even get the gearbox cleaned up as well, and also the sump, which is currently just held in with a couple of bolts because I took that off in the last episode. We'll get that cleaned up as well, and we'll get that fitted with a new gasket. We might also whip the rocker cover off and give that a clean up and some paint as well. So here's the paint I'm using for the block. I just picked this up at the local motor factors. There was a choice of colours. I usually paint all my blocks black, but this time I wanted something a little different, so I went for this sort of British racing green sort of colour. So yeah, I'm going to go over the engine just with a heat gun and stuff just to blow off any dust and sort of preheat the metal at the same time. We'll then sort of preheat this paint a little bit as well, then we'll just crack on and start painting it on. Now I've also started to clean up some of the bracketry that bolts up to the block. So this is the one that goes on the back of the block and it supports this sort of extension part of the gearbox. This one here just covers the back of the bell housing. And then this one is for the alternator, and then this one is also for the alternator. So these are all cleaned back to bare metal, and they've just had a quick coat of epoxy primer. I'm going to let that cure off and then they'll just get a coat of gloss black. I've also had the cam cover off and I've stripped that right back. So I've took off the big sort of oil filler neck thing, the breather bung from here, and all the little rubber sort of grommets for the where it bolts down. And then there's these little metal ones. So I've cleaned all this back up, cleaned the inside of it as well, and cleaned this back to bare metal. So this has got a coat of epoxy primer as well. And then just like the brackets, once this dries and cures off, it'll just get gloss black, just to clean it up a bit. As for the other ancillaries, the starter motor, I'm not going to paint that, I'm just going to clean that up. This is the engine mount and the power steering pump. I'm going to reuse this power steering pump. It looks like the original one for the van. I've spun it and there's no sort of funny noises or anything coming from it, so I'm going to reuse that because it was working just fine. I'll maybe clean up this engine mount bracket and just give it a lick of paint as well. The alternator, I'll just clean that back, and same with the oil filter cooler sandwich plate thing, I'll just clean that up as well and just leave it in sort of the alloy finish. And then I've got a bunch of new stuff here, so this is all my timing stuff, gaskets, there's a new clutch and stuff, but I'll go into all that when I come to fit it. Right, so the engine's now had its second coat of green on both sides, and I've just sort of touched up the sides there as well, and also this little bit here just above where the bell housing will be. These brackets are now painted in black. They've had a couple of coats of black, so they're just drying off. And same with the rocker cover. So that's had 2 or 3 coats of black as well, and that's just drying off. While that stuff's drying off, I've got the gearbox outside, so I'm going to pressure wash it and then degrease it and give it a bit of a scrub, and then I'll pressure wash it again, and then that should do it. Okay, so this first batch is all now dry, so we're moving on to the next one now. I've got it all cleaned up and sort of hanging up on the engine crane. So gearbox mount, engine mount, that's the power steering pump, just give that a wee clean up. Tiny little brackets, the power steering pump pulley, and then we've got the power steering pump tensioner for that belt. I'm just going to give all of them a quick lick of paint just to tidy them up. I've also got this metal coolant pipe. I've stripped that down, took all the rubber hoses off it, so I'll get that cleaned up now as well, and we'll get some paint on it. Okay, so that's most of the ancillaries now cleaned up and painted. So rocker cover, engine mounts, some of the pulleys, all that sort of stuff. I still need to clean up this inlet. I need to clean up this as well, and I'm just going to spray that in a sort of VHT black stuff. This I'm just going to leave a sort of alloy finish. And then finally on the engine, I need to take the sump off and clean that up as well. Okay, I've taken the sump back off the engine, and I've cleaned that right up. I've got all the grease and oil and stuff off it, so that's ready to go. I've also cleaned up the inlet, just took off all the alloy corrosion and scraped out the red that was on here as well. Also cleaned up the exhaust manifold, just wire wheeled all the rust off of that, took the old gasket off, and the same with the alternator. So I've cleaned that up and just took off any of the corrosion and stuff, and it's the same with this little oil cooler thing. So basically with these alloy things, I'm just going to give them a quick spray of clear coat just to hopefully stop any of that alloy corrosion coming up again. It might just give them a little bit of a shine. So same for the alternator, the top section of the inlet and the sump. As for this, I'm just going to give it a quick spray of some VHT black. It's probably not going to last too long, but it should just make it a little bit more presentable. Okay, I've started bolting a couple of things up now. So we've got that rear mount on that supports the gearbox for the drive shaft. Power steering pump is back on, engine mount, and some of the pulleys there as well. I've also got this oil cooler thing sort of fitted up as well, but I won't tighten that down until I've worked out the orientation for the coolant hose that goes into the back of here. On the cylinder head, I've replaced 2 of the studs. This one snapped and this one actually came out with the nut. The rest of them seem okay, so I've just left them rather than risking stripping any threads in the head by trying to remove them. I'm also going to fit this little coolant hose. So this one pops onto there, and then it pops onto this part, and then once that's on, I can then tighten this nut up in here to get this little oil cooler thing nipped up tight to this housing here. Okay, coolant hose is now on. This nut here is tightened up as well, ready for the oil filter when I get one. And then this little bracket here is on as well, and that's tightened in with a little hook, which, as I say, I think that just holds a coolant hose, which maybe goes to this or somewhere else. We'll suss all that out. I'll look back at my old videos to work all that out, but it's looking pretty good overall. Right, I've flipped the engine back round so that we're looking at the front of it, and the reason is because next up is the glow plugs. So I've got 5 new glow plugs here, and obviously this is a 5-cylinder engine, so I've got one here which is knackered because it split just there, so I definitely needed to change at least one. So you got 1, 2, 3, and then 4 and 5 sit kind of behind the pump. So I'm going to see how I get on, but my plan is to not move the pump at all. I'm hoping to sort of sneak in the back here, and then hopefully there's enough room just to leverage it out. But okay, finally got all the glow plugs changed now without having to move the pump at all. So the pump stayed exactly where it was, so did all the injector lines, everything. So the first one here is nice and easy. You can get a socket straight onto there. Number 2, access is good again. Get a spanner in under here. So it's 8mm for the little nut, and then these are 12mm. Number 3 is not too bad. You can see it from up here, and you can also get to it from underneath. Number 4, access is not too bad through this gap here. Number 5 is a tricky one. You can just see it in the back there. Now the easiest way to access number 5 is to take the pump belt cover off, and then you'll get to it through this gap here. So you can get a 12mm spanner through there to crack it loose. Now in my case, this one actually rounded off with a spanner. This is it here. And then I was trying to get vice grips and stuff like that in there. But what I ended up doing was basically broke off the end bit here. That's the little bit on the end that the little nut goes onto. So I broke off this bit here. And then what that allowed me to do was to get the ring end of the spanner in and round, and I was able to kind of pry it right on and then crack it loose from there. And then it's just a case of wiggling the spanner back and forth just to get it out. And then it's a little bit of a faff to put it back in, but once you've got it started, you should be good. Now in terms of the wiring for the glow plugs, you've just got these 2 red sort of jumper cables here. So I've given the ends, the sort of copper ring terminals, a good sand back to good metal as well while they're rough. So you've got 1, 2, and then from here it's sort of this like bus bar type thing, I guess. And on the end of this one here, there was actually a slit in it, which I think a previous owner might have done before just to make it easier to get it onto the little nut. You can just see the slit on the end there. But as you can see, I've cleaned all them up as well, so they should make nice contact now. And yeah, that's 5 new glow plugs, so we should have a good starting engine from cold. I've also fitted up the remainder of the coolant flanges. So I've got the main one here that's got a new thermostat and a new O-ring in behind it as well. And I just put a dab of high temp sealant there as well, just to hopefully ensure a good seal. We've also got this top one that bolts to the side of the head. Again, it's got a new O-ring and just a light dab of sealant where it meets the head. Finally, I've also replaced this one here that is on the side of the head. So it has one bolt, or sort of bolt slash stud, that fixes it in here. It then has an O-ring as well, and the bit that's snapped off of mine that you can see here actually pushes into the hole that's in the cylinder head, the bore in the cylinder head. So it's a very tight fit. So when you're fitting this one, don't just wind in the bolt and expect this to push in through. You've got to kind of put a bit of force onto the flange as you're nipping that bolt up. Again, just a little smear of sealant on the part that pushes into the bore, just to help it seal up. And then the final thing that I've bolted up to the front side of the engine for now is the alternator bracket up here. It bolts to the side of the head with 3 bolts, and then you've got this long bolt that acts as like a pivot bolt. We won't fit any of the other bracketry just yet because it might just get in the way of some of this timing stuff that we still need to change. Okay, so the next job on the list now is to flip the engine round again. We're going to clean up the bottom face of the sump. I'm going to clean up the oil pickup pipe again. We're going to get the sump fitted with a new gasket. Okay, that's the sump back on now, so obviously a new gasket. I did put a little bit of the high temp sealant on as well, just to help seal it up, and I've popped all the bolts back in exactly as they were and sort of torqued them up. There's also a new sump plug as well with a new copper washer in behind as well. So now we'll get the engine flipped back over and we'll get it off of the stand back onto the crane. And the reason we're doing that is because I want to change this rear main seal on the back of the crank. Okay, I've got the old one off. There's a little trick to getting these ones off actually, you might have saw in the video there. With these bolt holes here, here, and there's another one up here. You can use them just to wind a bolt in. And yeah, as you wind these bolts in, it sort of pulls the flange away from the block. So yeah, nice and easy to get this one off. I'm noticing there's a bit of a difference with the old one and the new one. I was quite surprised to see a gasket here, because when I was looking at the new one, I see it has like a rubber seal instead. Not sure if this is like a later design or something, but apart from that, they look exactly the same. So yeah, like I say, we'll get all this cleaned up and then we'll set about fitting a new one. Okay, I think that's the new rear main seal fitted now. This is the first time I've ever done one of these, so it was actually quite tricky just to get the seal on over the snout of the crank without it folding in on itself. But if you centralize that bit of plastic as best you can, it slips on pretty easily. So next up is to get the flywheel back on. So here's my flywheel here. Like I said before, the AABs have single mass flywheels. There's 8 bolts that hold them on, and these are stretch bolts. So don't reuse these, just get new ones, just to be sure. These are single use stretch bolts. Once they're torqued up, that's them. Clutch bolts, I'm just going to reuse the 6 clutch bolts that hold the pressure plate on. But yeah, the flywheel just needs a quick clean and then that can go straight back on. This here is the new flywheel bolts. So I bought them in packs of 6, so I've got 2 packs. I'll show you the part number as well. I'll double check these against the original bolts. And they're exactly the same, so N902-06103, and you need 8 of them if you're doing an AAB. I'm not sure about the other models. Okay, that's my flywheel on now. Just the bolts have just been nipped up for now. We're going to torque them up now. So these bolts go 60 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. And you're going to want to lock the crank from the other side, or else you're just going to turn the engine over here. So what I've done, quite simple. Just got a socket. It's a 27mm on that main crankshaft bolt. And then I've just got a bar, and basically the bar is just locking against the ground as I turn the flywheel bolts. So yeah, we'll go 60 Newton meters, then we'll just mark them all with a pen. We'll just put a little straight line up on each one of them, and then one by one we'll just turn them 90 degrees, and then that will be the flywheel on and torqued up. Okay, next thing to be fitted is the clutch. Like I say, I'm just going to be reusing the old clutch bolts. Now before I fit this clutch as well, I'm just going to give the flywheel a good spray down with some brake cleaner just to clean it up a bit. I'll also do the same with the pressure plate on this particular surface here, just to clean any of the sort of oils that they have on them in the packaging. So this particular clutch for this engine is 228mm wide, the friction plate. I think there's a few variations, so just make sure that you match up to whatever your old clutch was. In my case, it's 228. I don't have a clutch alignment tool or anything, so I'm basically just gonna eyeball it. Alrighty, so that's the new clutch now fitted. Went on okay. I actually put the engine up on the crane just so I could see better at eye level to try centralize it to the center of the crank, but I'm just doing that by eye. I think it's just about there, so it should be good enough now to throw on the gearbox next. Speaking of the gearbox, that's just sitting here. So I actually went about cleaning this right up and repainted it and repainted the 5th gear end cap and the engine mount and stuff like that. So now before I do fit the gearbox, I'm going to clean up this clutch fork and fit the new release bearing. Just a couple things before I fit the gearbox. So I've taken off the rear bracket that sits here. That's this one here. Just so it's a bit easier to slip the back of the box in here. And then the other thing is the old release bearing. So this clutch fork is now cleaned up and I've got the new bearing clipped into place. I just need to now grease the pivot points. So that one there, and the ones on the box as well. So on the inside of the box, I'll need to grease this pivot point here. I'll put a little bit of grease on the splines, and I also need to fit this. So what this is a little starter motor bush. It helps to centralize the shaft on the end of the starter motor. So it pushes into the gearbox, and then this end of the starter motor sits inside it. Now, when I took this starter motor off, that gearbox never had a bush at all. So this starter actually has quite a lot of play in it. I'm not sure if that's more than normal, but I envision that this starter might not last too long. But yeah, that little bush just pops inside the starter motor housing here. And then as I say, the starter will centralize in that bushing. It just helps to support it. Right, the box actually went on pretty easy there, easier than I was expecting. But I managed to get 4 of the bolts in, and then I realised I've completely forgot to fit something that's key, that sandwiches between the box and the engine. This plate right here. So the box is going to come back off. I'll get this plate on, and then we'll get the box back on. Okay, so that is the engine and the gearbox now all back together. I've thrown the starter motor back on as well. And I have to say it's looking pretty damn good. Much cleaner than it was before. So all that's left to do really now is to obviously fit the new timing belts. I also need to fit the remainder of the coolant hoses as well. We've obviously got the cam cover to go back on and the inlet manifold to go back on as well. And then of course we'll have things like the alternator and various other pulleys and stuff as well. But all that is going to be saved for part 3 of this engine rebuild series. I'm going to end this one here. So if you did make it this far, thank you very much for watching. Please drop a comment below, like, subscribe to the channel, all that good stuff. We'll catch you in part 3 of the engine rebuild. Cheers, take care.